I'm in rural New South Wales on some private property that has a feature that's not totally uncommon, but is perhaps a little bit morbid because it's home to a private cemetery dating back to 1861. So these are the graves of Mary Amelia Catherine Bootle, Francis Bootle and George Forrester. This is usually the part where I tell you some fascinating story about who these people were, but in this case I can't actually tell you anything about them apart from what's written on their tombstones because I haven't been able to find a single piece of information about them. But regardless of a lack of information, I still have a story because what's interesting here is that these graves are on private property, which raises a few interesting questions about owning a graveyard. So what's the deal? Do you actually own this bit of land? Do you own what's under it? Can you do anything with it? Do you have to do anything with it? And are you obligated to allow people to access it? Well, yes and no and no and no and maybe. Also, I'm not a lawyer or a solicitor or a real estate agent, so probably don't listen to me. But anyway, you do own it. It is your property, more or less. You own the land. You don't own what's buried under it, though. According to the Human Tissue Act of 1982, yep, that's the thing, it's illegal to buy or sell human remains in Australia. I guess in the case of transfer of real estate, you don't always buy everything that's part of a property, kind of like how you might buy a house, but you might also get an old piece of Tupperware in the kitchen cupboard or a rug in the hallway. Those items weren't technically part of the sale, but you got them. In the same sense, the owners of this property may not have actually bought the deceased here, they're just kind of part of the deal. Can you do anything with it? Not really. You can't bulldoze a private cemetery and build something on it. You can choose to maintain it though, which leads nicely into the next question, which is, do you have to do anything with it? From what I can tell, you're probably actually well within your legal rights to neglect it. You probably shouldn't, but you're not obligated to maintain it. This one has been in this condition for many, many years, long before the current owners purchased the land. You're not necessarily obligated to maintain a private cemetery, but in as much as you're not allowed to bulldoze it, you probably shouldn't let it deteriorate completely. Are you obligated to allow people access to it? This is kind of the most interesting question here because the short answer is yeah. You do have to let people access it, but I guess the variable here is whether anyone actually wants to access it. The fine print varies from state to state, but in New South Wales, generally an easement would be written up allowing access under specific conditions. An easement is basically a written agreement that person A can use part of person B's property for a specific purpose. How that agreement is drawn up would depend on the kind of access that the cemetery attracts, whether it's just family members or if the cemetery is of some historical significance and should be publicly accessible. So basically, if someone wants access to a private cemetery, the legalities are such that it's probably going to be pretty difficult to stop them from doing so. As I said though, it depends on whether anyone actually wants to access the place at all. This private graveyard, for example, is incredibly undisturbed and hasn't caused any problems for the current owners. I guess the people buried here have no local descendants, or at least no one that visits them. So are there any benefits to owning a historic private graveyard? Well, sure there are, beyond owning a piece of history anyway. It's generally not permitted for a person to be buried on private property in Australia anymore. Some states are a bit more lenient than others, but as a rule it's something that requires a ton of paperwork, and generally the answer is going to be no. If you want to be buried, you need to be buried in a proper cemetery, but if you're looking for a loophole to flout that law, one of the many criteria under which an application for private burial might be accepted is if there is physical evidence of pre-existing burials such as headstones and fencing, which is what we have right here. Why would you want to be buried alongside an unrelated family from 100 years ago? Well, that's beyond me, but if you really want to be buried on your own land when you go, having some existing infrastructure like this might actually help your case. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so don't act on my advice, and I really wish I could tell you more about these people, but if I find any more information, I'll be sure to share it with you. This video was made with the kind support of the owners of this property who have allowed me access to their historic private cemetery. If you found this video interesting, please consider hitting the subscribe button, which is somewhere down there. You can also follow IDU Curiosity on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram if that's your kind of thing. Thank you for watching.